Let's maul in the Central Committee. Let's cringe in the Central Committee. Let's bog in the Central Committee right now.
Jumping the gun on Juneteenth a bit. I see a lot of ADOS shit on the timeline. It feels crazy, and Radlib saying the holiday is only for ADOS. No, it's not. No, it's not. Let me just say this about like weird Radlib garbage where they try to like gatekeep stuff due to skin color. Like, we should have a national holiday celebrating the end of slavery because you're not black. Listen. Slavery in the United States of America was done on a racial caste system. But we should always celebrate liberation collectively. Because liberation, while one person is oppressed, I'm oppressed. And so when people are liberated, I am liberated. These artificial racial distinctions, they're fake. That's what created the racial caste system in the first place. So we're gonna celebrate Juneteenth. Too fucking bad. Holy shit. Like Bernie said, are you ready to fight for someone else? Exactly. We are all gonna die. These people are literally insane. Of course. Oh, okay. This is a different argument completely. Juneteenth is not for Africans, West Indians, Afro-Latinos, none of that. While the diaspora as a whole was affected by slavery / forced migration, that does not make us all descendants of chattel slavery that happened in the U.S. Any reparations and restitution we seek should come from those who colonized us and opened up our coast to slave traders. My ancestors were not enslaved by the United States, they were enslaved by France. We, and the rest of the diaspora, have our own Independence Days, Flag Days, regional and tribal holidays. I promise you it's okay to give Black Americans Juneteenth. I mean, that's totally legitimate. That's a completely different argument. That's a completely different argument. That's a totally valid argument. But I will say this: don't make the United States off the hook. Don't put the United States off the hook. You know, don't do that. Since I was just saying why all Americans should celebrate Juneteenth, let's watch this little video from Vox. See what they say. Let's critique some libs.
Juneteenth is a deeply emotional moment for enslaved people because for decades, for centuries, enslaved people prayed for, hoped for, fought for in the form of slave rebellions, running away, bought their freedom when they could. And if you read slave narratives, if you listen to spirituals from the era of slavery, you know that enslaved people longed for freedom. This was something that had been hoped for, but many believe may never come.
Well, the motor promised to give me $40 a month in bed. Well, lots of the boys say they ain't want it. They rather go free, you know.
Being able to go wherever they wanted, being able to wonder about. For enslaved people, it was an expression of their freedom.
Well, Matt Porter was the one that long Miss Porter, one of our white folks in Navy. He was coming along, we all sitting on the fence, and the colored soldier come along and asked her did she want to go with him. And she said yes, she mounted one of them horses. She went on with them. I never did see her and hear tell of her no more.
When I think about Juneteenth, I think about it in the context of Emancipation Day celebrations that began January 1, 1863. They took on a whole new meaning when slavery was formally abolished after 1865. You would have had African-American veterans who fought in the Civil War be prominent in these celebrations, dressed in their military garb, speeches from enslaved people. The most prominent Black politicians singing of hymns, spirituals, discussions of registering to vote. Enslaved people celebrating in public their newfound freedom was an act of resistance. Because we have to remember, slavery came to an end after a 4 years bloody civil war. Still the bloodiest conflict in American history. Many people in the South and in the nation who did not want to see slavery abolished fought tooth and nail to block the 13th Amendment. The abolition of slavery created a huge humanitarian crisis in the South.
Thank you.
Suddenly 4 million people have very little means to take care of themselves, to support themselves, and do so in a really hostile environment. So the military was necessary to make sure that enslaved people got the food, the medicine, the shelter that they needed in order to survive. They're also there to protect, to the extent that that was possible, freed people from violence, from recriminations, from slaveholders, from Confederates who still hadn't given up the fight.
And I remember when the Yankees stopped here, and the Yankees stopped right on the corner of Square, and they prosecuted people, you know. We go to the ground team, and they take them, hang them over the slum. That's the punishment they got. Next time you see, they come a whole troop of Yankees, all riding horses. Big guns hanging on. I said, Mama, where are they going? They're all going home now.
When the last federal troops leave the South, it's a signal to Southerners. The federal government wasn't going to put its might into ensuring the civil rights of Black people would be observed. You have 20, 30 years later, Black people being lynched in public, and there isn't a federal anti-lynching law to protect them. In most communities in America, there's a history of lynching and racial violence, and very few communities have marked that, commemorated that. Every decade since the end of slavery, Black people have been more educated, accrued more wealth, more status in American society. Every decade since 1865. But there's been one constant, and that constant is the presence of random racist violence. What I see in George Floyd's murder was a white police officer attempting to dominate and to subdue a Black man who was not resisting, who could not resist. Even though slavery came to an end in 1865, the desire to master and dominate Black bodies did not. And we have never dealt with that. These are the kinds of stark realities that are highlighted during Juneteenth. If Black people's lives can be expunged through racist violence and no one is held accountable, how free are we? Are we free?
I'll have you know that the anti-lynching law was just passed in 2020. I don't think it was actually signed, was it? Was the anti-lynching law actually signed? Yeah. We still don't have an anti-lynching law, I don't believe. Objected by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul.
George Floyd! I can't breathe! I can't breathe! Hands up! Don't shoot!
Black America is grieving right now. We've been grieving. I just hope that they can finally feel our pain, because I know everyone out here has encountered with police that they never get their feelings or like anything they feel across.
All these people came together. We came together and we stood up for something.
Rand Paul holds up anti-lynching legislation as he seeks changes to bill. Republican Senator Paul of Kentucky said Wednesday he's holding up popular bipartisan legislation to make lynching a federal crime, a long-sought goal of supporters that is actually relevant now against the backdrop of nationwide protests against police mistreatment of African Americans. He addressed the problems he sees with the bill, which passed the House on a 10-4 vote. And Senate supporters hope to pass by unanimous consent until he objected. So it looks like they never passed it. Yeah. Push for federal anti-lynching law hits another impasse. The Senate fumbled the ball. First, the pandemic erupted, dominated the attention of Congress, and pushing the Till Act further down the calendar. It finally came up in June, whereupon Senator Rand Paul complained the language defining lynching was way too broad. His objection torpedoed unanimous consent. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Paul's fellow Kentuckian, chose not to bypass the standoff and simply order a roll call vote. The Till Act has language in the Senate docket ever since. And it died. Yeah. Yeah, that died. So, there you go. No lynching, no federal lynching law. I'm from Pittsburgh, but my family lived in Lynchburg, VA in the early 2000s. We were called Yankees, and our neighbors proudly flew Confederate flags. So gross. Glad to be back home above the Mason-Dixon line, which a lot of people don't realize is the southern border of Pennsylvania. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's some dark shit right there, chat. That's some dark shit. Some dark shit. All right, so we were off on Juneteenth. But
the nation is commemorating Juneteenth this weekend. It's the first new federal holiday in 36 years. On June 19th, 1865, Union Army soldiers informed enslaved black people in Galveston, Texas, that they were free. The news came 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and 2 months after the end of the Civil War. President Biden signed the legislation this week, officially recognizing the day as a federal holiday. CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini has more from the White House.
From a Juneteenth flag raising in Boston.
This is an amazing day in our city.
To a march in St. Paul. Americans celebrated their first new federal holiday in 36 years. Also known as Jubilee Day and Black Independence Day, Juneteenth marks the moment in 1865 when, 2 months after the end of the Civil War, Union troops finally got all the way to Texas to tell the enslaved people there they were free.
This is one of the ways to acknowledge that our ancestors weren't free for 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
94-year-old Opal Lee has been fighting for federal recognition of Juneteenth for decades.
You are an incredible woman, Ms. Opal. You really are.
She got a front row seat when the president signed the bipartisan bill and one of his pens. But she says the fight isn't over.
We've still got much work to do, and we see this as a great beginning.
Advocates argue that work includes passing federal voting rights legislation, currently stalled in Congress, to protect against new restrictive voting laws in states like Florida and Georgia that critics say disproportionately impact people of color.
We are talking about the preservation of a right. That is the right of citizenship.
Hey, Dennis.
And a police reform bill, which President Biden encouraged lawmakers to pass in April during his speech to a joint session of Congress.
But let's get it done next month, by the first anniversary of George Floyd's death.
But that anniversary came and went without congressional action.
Lana, the federal government was closed yesterday, but today is the actual holiday. So expect to see many more Juneteenth celebrations across the country.
Christina, thank you. While some applauded the new federal holiday, some advocates in the Black community have called the move performative and argue that it does not do enough to address the systemic racism that still faces Black Americans to this day.
Obviously true.
CBS News political contributor Antoine Seawright joins me now.
Obviously true. Like, we have no policing reform bill. We've got very, very little actually done. So yes, a holiday is a lot easier to do than, say, like, I don't know, something actually important.
Now for more. Antoine, first of all, happy Juneteenth. Good to see you. And then
happy Juneteenth.
Talk to us a little bit about why making Juneteenth a federal holiday was so important and what this day means to all of us Americans.
Well, Lana, you know the history. It was 2.5 years after Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation. The word did not travel across the South to Galveston, Texas. And so there were 2,000 Union troops who made their way to deliver the message that slavery is no longer a thing. If I think about the stories I've heard growing up from my grandparents across the South, although we knew the Emancipation Proclamation gave us freedom, we went from slavery to sharecroppers. And in their own way, that was still a case of slavery in its own regard. And so fast forward to tape, 40 years later, it was because of Black voters all across this country that gave Democrats both the majority in the House, in the Senate, and the presidency. And now Juneteenth is a holiday. It's a day of freedom. It's a day of liberation. It's a day of celebration. And while we pause to do those things, Lana, we do not press the stop button because there's so much more work to do. I was so proud to see the first Black woman vice president of the United States say, happy Juneteenth. And while we all celebrate that, but if you think about what's going on, why she was saying that, there's still Black people fighting for our right to freely participate at the ballot box. There's still issues of poverty that exist in our community that make no comparison to communities that do not look like ours. Antoine Seawright is 3 to 4 times more likely to be killed or mishandled at the hands of law enforcement, more so than people who do not look like him. Environmental injustices, the have and have-nots conversations weight our communities down. And so while we pause to celebrate, we still have to push towards progress in this country.
And Antoine, as we were talking a little bit about history, it was on June 19th that absolute equality, that phrase, absolute equality, was declared between former slaves and former slave masters. More than 150 years later, Black Americans are still fighting for equality and justice. Talk to us about how the holiday serves as an opportunity for our nation to reckon with that reality.
Well, I think that you have to learn from history so you do not repeat history. And my grandmother used to say when I was growing up, Lana, she would oftentimes say, what you do not know can hurt you, but what you do know can help you. The fact that Americans will now have to fully pay attention, all of us, not just Black people, not just those of us who may attend an institution of higher education and so forth, everyone will now pause, I think, a bit more and pay attention to what the history and the period of slavery meant to this country and how the Black experience has helped shape what the American experiment looks like. I remember one of my last conversations with John Lewis before he slipped away. He said to me, and I never forget this line, he said, all we ever wanted in this country as Black Americans, those of us who are the African seed and the American son and daughter, is oceans of justice and rivers of fairness. Oceans of justice and rivers of fairness. If you ask the question to anyone who looks like me or who has background of experiences that look like mine, I think we have a long ways to go, even though we've come a long way.
You know, Antoine, I think that there's something that's particularly important about Juneteenth is a celebration that many communities have celebrated, and in many ways that doesn't change, but having it become a federal holiday, something that every single American needs to acknowledge and celebrate, that enslaved people were finally freed. It's such an important step for us as a nation. What more needs to be done, though, about issues like voting rights, police reform, closing the racial wealth gap, that we need to keep ever present in our minds?
Well, look, Lana, while I think it's a gigantic step, it's certainly not the final step. The same bipartisan spirit that delivered Juneteenth as a federal holiday, first federal holiday in 40 years, is the same bipartisan spirit that should deliver us free and fair access to the ballot box, that should close the wealth gap in this country, should push us to a place of not just equity, but equity and equality, because there are two differences. It should force us to have real conversations and acknowledge the fact that racism and big...
All right, I'm gonna stop this guy right here. I'm not interested in conversation. I'm interested in action. We can sit around and converse all fucking day, but if nothing changes, then what's the fucking point? There is no, and by the way, there's no interest in this from the right. This is purely a question of power. The right is implacably opposed. The right wing will do whatever they can within their power to block this. The right wing will do everything they can to disrupt and prevent any kind of equity, any kind of redistribution, any kind of restructuring of society. This is a project where they are either defeated or they defeat us. They're not changing their mind. They have to be forced to change their mind. I know that's uncomfortable for a lot of people here because the thing of force, the question of force, that makes you very nervous. Why can't we all just get along? Well, we can't get along because they won't get along with us. They're not interested in justice. They're not interested in fairness. So that's your choice. You have a system that's unequal, that's oppressive, or you have justice. That's it.
Bigotry and hate, those things exist, and it's up to our leaders to push back and call those things out when we know they're happening in the ecosystem. I think that's what we have to do. I think that's what this moment should mean for all of us. And I do not think that this is one thing that could say for other people who may not agree with the experiences of ours to say, well, just because I support Juneteenth or I know about Juneteenth, that does not make me racist. No, we can't get into that posture. In fact, we should lose this as a growth opportunity and a continued learning opportunity, because when I'm better, you're better. When you're better, I'm better. When all of us are better, then I think America's better.
Well, I have you, my friend. I want to talk to you about some other reporting you've been doing. And obviously, this week marked 6 years since the Charleston church shooting. A white supremacist opened fire inside the Mother Emanuel AME church and murdered 9 people. You sat down with some of the victims' family members. Talk to us about how this tragedy is still impacting them today.
You know, Lana, I had to shed a tear on Thursday because not only was it 6 years that 21-year-old white supremacists walked into historic Mother Emanuel and murdered 9 people who worshiped in their God, but we also signed into law, the president signed into law, the Juneteenth celebration, Juneteenth national holiday. So while we celebrate on one regard, it's a friendly reminder that America still has a long ways to go. The fact that we're still having more and more Mother Emanuel type situations in my lifetime, something that I heard in the lifetime of my sharecropping grandparents. And so when I sat down with the Pinckney family, when I sat down with Pastor Eric Manning, who's now the pastor of historic Mother Emanuel, it was for me a very emotional time, But it was a consequential time because you know what? That could have been any of us, Lana. It could have been you, could have been me, it could have been my mother. I knew Senator Pinckney, Pastor Pinckney very well. I did almost every campaign he had in his most recent political career. And so we had a personal connection. And then I'm fifth generation AME. And so to know that my uncle's an AME bishop and know that it could have been a worship service that he was preaching at, or that a Bible study that he was conducting that could have turned into one of the worst massacres in our nation's history, those things are a friendly reminder that racism still exists, bigotry still exists. There's still white supremacists walking around like Dylann Roof, who has the thinking and the mindset of Dylann Roof. And that's why it's a big deal for us to have this holiday known as Juneteenth, so we can learn from the stains of history that exist in this country so we do not repeat those sins over and over again. That's what the American experiment is all about.
Exactly what your grandmother articulated so well. Antoine, thank you.
Thank you.
And speaking of this, Democratic lawmakers introduced a resolution to amend the 13th Amendment to end forced prison labor. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon and Rep. William Lacey Clay of Missouri introduced a joint resolution this week that would remove... Okay, this was back in December, because Lacey Clay got primaried by Cori Bush. That would remove the 13th Amendment's punishment clause, or language that accepted convicted prisoners from the ban on slavery and involuntary servitude. Our abolition amendment seeks to finish the job that President Lincoln started by ending the punishment clause in the 13th Amendment to eliminate the dehumanizing and discriminatory forced labor of prisoners for profit that has been used to drive the over-incarceration of African Americans since the end of the Civil War. When it was ratified in 1865, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal except as punishment for a crime of which one has been convicted. The Abolition Amendment would strike that clause from the 13th Amendment and end forced labor among prisoners, the congresswoman said. Work programs for prisoners were continued on a voluntary basis. A.V. Sofer, a professor and former dean of the University of Hawaii, told CNN that it's unlikely that efforts to amend the constitutional amendment will succeed. It may be more beneficial to institute partial remedies, he said, like the federal statute that outlaws voluntary and involuntary peonage, a type of servitude by which people who owe debts work until those debts are paid. Prison labor is a lucrative industry. NPR reported in July that as of the last federal count in 2005, over 1.5 million prisoners were working. Unicor, a federal prison labor program, generates over $500 million in revenue every year. Many states, mostly in the South, don't pay inmates for working regular prison jobs. And the high end of their wages for regular prison jobs rarely exceed $1 an hour. Senators Bernie Sanders and Ed Markey, among others, have co-sponsored the amendment, which has earned the support of social justice organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and The Color of Change. And, lawmakers have, here's some prison labor photos. Isn't that great? So they're reviving this. Totally exciting stuff. Arizona prisons be 100% for profit with contracts that say the state of Arizona guarantees the prisoners. Yeah. No, slavery hasn't ended. We still have the Electoral College, the filibuster, voter suppression, racist laws, prisons. Exactly. Wikipedia cites their sources and it's actually a good info source. You're clearly worried about black men have a... Okay, let's play. Calm down. Don't do stereotypes. Even if you think they're positive stereotypes, they're still stereotypes, and you shouldn't do that shit. Don't categorize an entire group of people and then put expectations on them based on their race. That's absurd. That's absurd. All right, what else do we got here? All right, chat. Let's do a little bit. Let's do a little bit more. I'm feeling like we need something a little bit more spicy.
Outrage after the murder of George Floyd last year, the tide changed enormously. And my next guest, NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, has a new documentary that examines how protest movements change history in this country, and he talks about his own fight for racial justice and what he learned from meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Watch this.
This picture shows me at a press conference that Dr. King gave. I was in a journalism workshop, and I was given press credentials to cover this event with the national media.
Kareem.
In 1963, he had been voted Man of the Year. At that point, I wasn't like the biggest fan of nonviolence. I was angry at the way black people were being brutalized, and I wanted to strike back. But after meeting Dr. King and, really getting into his philosophy, I saw where the power was in it.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar joins me now. His documentary, Fight the Power, The Movements That Changed America, it airs tomorrow night.
Now, Kareem is based, chat. Do you guys like Kareem? Are you interested in interviews with Kareem? And to go right out the gate and be like, I wasn't the biggest fan of nonviolence. Honestly, could he be any more based? I don't think he could be any more based.
Tonight, 8 p.m. on the History Channel. Thank you for joining us. It's so good to see you.
And what makes him based is he starts out from that fighter mentality, but then he sees, hey, nonviolence is good. Nonviolence is something that we can use effectively. And maybe we can achieve some of our objectives with cooperation and solidarity. And that's an amazing thing to see.
You've led such a rich life. I mean, it's just unbelievable the things that you've experienced and what you've accomplished. So thank you for that. What a moment that must have been for you to interview Martin Luther King Jr. What did you take away from that?
Well, it's great talking with you, Don. At the time, you don't really understand where you are and what you're doing. That's how it was for me. This was just like, geez, I got an opportunity to do this. But it really made me take a serious look at exactly what was happening and why, and balancing Dr. King's philosophies against the philosophy, say, of Malcolm X. More or less was, I could see that they were both sides of the same coin, but that Dr. King's approach was the one that was going to work for Black Americans. Yeah. And it was very clear that by embarrassing the powers that be and showing them to be the bullies that they are, we take their power away.
That's here too.
And we make people listen to us as human beings. And I value that my whole life now. It has helped me make good choices. And it's a very special time in my life, a very special moment in my life.
Yeah, and here we are, Kareem, all these years later, President Biden signing a bill making Juneteenth a federal holiday. I had D.L. Hughley on last night, and he said America is the only place where you ask for justice, but you get a holiday. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's taken a little bit too long for this to happen, for us to be completely happy about it. In some ways, we're more relieved than happy. But I think that when people understand what Black Americans have been through in human terms, I think that is the steps that we need to take. And I think that's happening now. It was the unfortunate circumstances of Mr. Floyd's murder, but it enabled a lot of white Americans to see the truth to what Black Americans have been saying for 400 years.
Yeah. Your documentary is called Fight the Power, The Movements That Changed America. It's about power, the power of protest and resistance, the catalyst for change. And it includes all groups impacted by bigotry and discrimination. Why was it so important to tell the stories of all these different groups?
Well, it's important to tell the stories of all marginalized groups because until we understand and make sure that all groups are free, all marginalized groups have the rights and protections that every other group has. Until that happens, none of us are free. Because no matter what particular issue it might be, you're going to end up in the box where everybody discriminates against you, and now you have to deal with it. So it's absolutely important that the whole idea of empathy and understanding how these events
Alicia,
and these situations touch everybody. It doesn't matter your background. Sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with this.
I want to ask you about this. I understand that you were inspired from a young age by the book, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin.
Yes,
it is the book that inspired me to write my book, This Is the Fire. What did you learn from it, and how did it change you?
Well, it changed me insofar as it explained to me how racism is the American original sin. It's often spoke of in that terms, but that makes a lot of sense when you look at it objectively like that, and it gives you an idea of what you can do to change your circumstances and force people to acknowledge your humanity and to force them to accept the fact that your rights and privileges have to be accepted. And it takes a while. It takes patience, and there are setbacks. But
yeah, we saw that.
Unfortunately, that's what we have to do. But that's the only way that change can occur.
Tonight, could the election...
Pretty exciting stuff, Chad. Pretty exciting stuff. And Kareem continues to be a pretty based individual. All right. Well, to close out our conversations on Juneteenth, Trump's remarks about black people in the book. Did you guys see this? Trump on black voters. Holy shit. Holy. This thing is insane. The comment that he's quoted as saying. All right, let's get going. Let's get this going.
Take up work on one of the president's big list items. Majority Leader Schumer plans to hold the first vote to move forward on the voting rights bill.
We'll get to uniform Democratic support for protecting voting rights in a vote next Tuesday. My strong belief is we are not going to let a strategic Mitch McConnell-led Republican opposition to progress block a Democratic majority's ability to do what the American public needs.
More on that point straight ahead. Right now, it's highly unlikely any Republicans will cross over and join those Democratic senators. McConnell has pledged they won't. As for that bipartisan infrastructure deal, Biden said today he expects to see a plan emerge on Monday. It comes as we're getting yet another rather astonishing picture of the former president. This comes from Wall Street Journal reporter Michael Bender, author of the forthcoming book, Frankly, We Did Win This Election, the inside story of how Trump lost. In a piece for Politico based on his new book, Bender describes how Trump claims he, quote, made Juneteenth very famous after he was told his administration had put out statements in each of the first years in office commemorating the day.
Fuck?
The book also notes Trump told advisors he wished he'd get a more aggressive response to the protests after George Floyd's murder and that he regretted supporting his son-in-law Jared Kushner's push for criminal justice reform. Bender writes that Trump told one confidant, quote, I've done all this stuff for the blacks. It's always Jared telling me to do this. And they all blank hate me, and none of them are going to vote for me.
Holy shit. I've often said that Donald Trump could say the N-word. Like, literally call a black person the N-word on national TV. And the Republican Party base would not budge 1 inch. Does anyone doubt that? Does anyone doubt that? Not only did he do nothing for black people, he also exposed that it was all Jared's idea. Exactly. They all think like they absolutely do. He blames Jared Kushner and Ivanka on him losing. Also, he did mention how no one knew about Juneteenth until he became president. No matter what it is, it's always about me with Trump. Always. Every fucking time. Tariq is a kind of conservative BRG. Kind of like a weirdo, anti-trans, homophobic conservative. He's a weirdo. Holy shit, dude. Holy fucking shit, dude. We do politics here every morning starting at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. You can watch us here on Twitch. We're the morning guy. The morning politics guy. Politics Frogs in every single day. Same time, 10 a.m. Day in, day out. And we carry you through your morning and early afternoon politics needs. And if you need more, Mike from PA, we have a YouTube channel. We talked about suburbs, the My Pillow guy, Ted Cruz. We talked about DSA. Amazing. Making fun of Tim Pool. Amazing. Look at all of these amazing videos. Get in there, watch them. We have me on Twitter. You gotta follow me on Twitter, chat. I'm at 20,614 subs. That means I got like 40 followers on Twitter in the last day. You can do better than that. You can do better than that. Go follow us on Twitter. And of course, join the Discord, where we have an incredible community of left-wing streamers. We have left-wing community. We talk about the stream. We talk about politics. There's gaming content. It's a really awesome, supportive place. Direct action, mutual aid. And you can just let off some steam. And also, you can help produce the show. One of the things I do is I look at the links that are put into the news content suggestions chat room on the Discord. Join the Discord, come hang out, and maybe what you want me to talk about will be part of the next show.